They called her the Ghost of the Range, a myth whispered in data streams and after-action reports. Gunnery Sergeant Croft called her a liability, a civilian anomaly in his world of disciplined steel and gunpowder. He saw a woman who did not belong, a scientist playing at war. By the time the mountain shuddered and the air itself bent to a single, impossible command, only one of them would be right. The silence that followed her shot, a silence that echoed for miles through the jagged peaks, would redefine the very meaning of authority for every soul at Forward Operating Base Black Ridge. FOB Black Ridge was a wound in the earth, carved into the hostile gray stone of the Asmar Range. It existed as an act of defiance against geography itself. The mountains surrounding it were not the majestic, rolling kind from postcards. They were knives, honed sharp by relentless winds and ancient geological violence. They stabbed at a sky that was often the color of a fresh bruise, a thin and unforgiving canopy of air that made lungs burn and engines gasp. The constant low-frequency hum that permeated the base was not from the generators, though they added their own diesel-choked growl to the chorus. It was the sound of the planet's bones groaning under immense pressure, a subliminal reminder that the very ground beneath their boots was unstable, alive, and utterly indifferent to the small human drama playing out upon its surface. Life here was a study in sensory abrasion, the metallic tang of cold air, the gritty taste of dust that found its way into everything, the smell of ozone and hot wiring from the overworked comms shack, and the sight of rock, endless, implacable rock. Into this theater of grit and tension, she had arrived. Her name was Alara Vance, but to the Marines of Black Ridge, she was simply the contractor. She carried no rank, wore no uniform, and moved with a quiet economy that made her seem to fade into the background. She was of average height, with a build that suggested endurance rather than strength, and her face was a study in neutrality, her expressions so subtle they were often missed entirely. She did not participate in the casual bravado of the mess hall or the grim humor of the barracks. Instead, she spent her days in a small, prefabricated hut on the edge of the perimeter, a space that bristled with strange antennae and was cluttered with equipment that looked more at home in a university geophysics lab than a war zone. Her routine was a source of constant, low-grade speculation among the Marines. They would see her at dawn, long before the first muster, standing on the edge of a precipice with a device that measured atmospheric density, her focus absolute. She collected rock samples, crushing them into fine powder to analyze their composition on a portable mass spectrometer. She deployed a web of tiny solar-powered seismic sensors across the ridgelines, their data feeding back to the ruggedized tablet that was her constant companion. She was not studying the enemy. She was studying the battlefield itself, dissecting its every geological and meteorological secret, with a clinical passion that unsettled the men who were trained to dominate terrain, not converse with it. To them, the world was a thing of cover and concealment, of firing lanes and dead ground. To her, it was a dynamic system of isobars, thermal layers, substrate resonance, and Coriolis drift. She was mapping the invisible forces that govern their existence, and they found it profoundly strange. Gunnery Sergeant Elias Croft found it more than strange. He found it offensive. Croft was the living embodiment of the Marine Corps' old guard. He was a man carved from the same granite as the mountains he occupied, his face a roadmap of desert campaigns, and his voice a blunt instrument honed by years of shouting over the din of battle. He was the senior sniper instructor for the entire sector, a living legend whose personal rifle had accounted for more enemy combatants than a company of infantry. His world was one of simple, brutal truths: proper breathing, trigger control, windage, and the unwavering application of force. He believed in muscle memory, instinct, and the visceral connection between a shooter and his weapon. He saw Vance and her sterile, data-driven methodology as a perversion of his craft, a sacrilege against the warrior's art. He had watched her for 3 days, his disapproval hardening with each observation. He saw a civilian, a woman, a boffin in the parlance of the grunts, who had been given inexplicable access to his domain. She was an anomaly, a variable he could not control, and Gunnery Sergeant Croft did not tolerate uncontrolled variables. His authority on Black Ridge was absolute, second only to the FOB's commanding officer, and even the CO deferred to Croft on all matters of long-range engagement. The firing range was his church, the sniper hide his sanctuary, and he was about to find a heretic in the pews. The confrontation, when it came, was as predictable as the sunrise. It was a cold, clear morning, the air so thin it felt sharp in the throat. Alara was calibrating a new set of atmospheric sensors near the primary firing line, her attention wholly consumed by the stream of numbers flowing across her tablet. The sharp crack of a .338 Lapua Magnum echoed from down the range, followed by the distant clang of lead hitting steel. Croft was running his advanced marksman through a high-angle firing drill, a task that required immense skill in this terrain. He walked down the line, his boots crunching on the gravel, his shadow falling over Alara long before he spoke. "That's close enough, contractor," he barked. The sound was designed to startle, to assert dominance. Alara did not flinch. She finished her input on the tablet, tapped the screen twice to save the calibration file, and only then did she turn her head slowly to look at him. Her eyes, a pale, clear gray, held his gaze without challenge and without submission. They simply registered his presence. "Gunnery Sergeant," she acknowledged. Her voice was low and even, devoid of inflection. It was the voice of someone reporting data, not engaging in conversation. Croft gestured dismissively at her array of equipment. A small tripod held a laser anemometer, its beam invisible as it measured wind speed at 3 different altitudes simultaneously. A ground-penetrating radar unit sat nearby, silent and waiting. "What is all this junk?" he demanded, his voice loud enough for his trainees to pause their drills and watch. "I'm trying to teach my Marines how to shoot, not how to read tea leaves. Pack it up. You're a distraction." Alara's gaze drifted from his face to the mountain peak that served as the backstop for the range, a massive slab of schist and granite nearly 5 kilometers away. "I'm mapping the thermal updrafts generated by the morning sun hitting the eastern face," she stated, as if discussing the weather, "and correlating them with the micro-tremors from the subduction zone 7 miles to the north. It creates a chaotic variable in terminal ballistics at this range." A few of the younger Marines exchanged confused glances. Croft's face tightened, a muscle jumping in his jaw. He was used to being the expert, the sole proprietor of the arcane knowledge of long-range shooting. Her technical jargon was a foreign language, and he interpreted it as a challenge to his authority. He took a step closer, invading her personal space. He was a wall of muscle and barely contained aggression. "Let me tell you what determines terminal ballistics out here, Dr. Vance," he said, deliberately misusing a title he assumed she didn't have to mock her academic air. It's skill, it's experience, it's the Mark I eyeball and a gut feeling for the wind that you can't get from one of your little video games. He tapped her tablet with a thick, calloused finger. This is a world of blood and bone and iron. Your numbers don't mean a thing out here. You're a civilian, you are a guest, and you are in my way. Alara did not react to the provocation. She did not shrink from his proximity or rise to the bait of his insults. She simply looked at the finger he had placed on her screen, then back to his eyes. The substrate composition is primarily quartz diorite with significant gneiss intrusions, she said, her tone as flat and hard as the rocks she described. It has a resonant frequency of 2.8 hertz. When the prevailing wind speed exceeds 15 knots from the northwest, as it is predicted to do in 1 hour, the resulting aeolian vibrations will match that frequency. Your firing solutions will be off by as much as 2 meters at 4,000 yards. Your gut feeling can't account for geology, Gunnery Sergeant. A short, sharp silence followed. Croft stared at her, his mind struggling to process the assault of clinical facts. He had no idea what quartz diorite was, and he didn't care. What he understood was that she had not backed down. She had countered his pronouncement on the warrior's spirit with a lecture on rocks. In front of his men, she had used her intellect as a shield, and it had deflected his verbal aggression completely. He felt a surge of hot, frustrated anger. He saw her not just as an annoyance, but as an existential threat to his worldview. "This is a warning, Vance," he snarled, his voice dropping to a low growl. "Stay out of my way. Stick to your lab and your rocks. The real work is done by men, not by machines and academic theories." He turned on his heel and stalked back toward his students, shouting for them to resume firing, his voice louder and harsher than before, as if to physically reassert the authority he felt had been questioned. Alara watched him go. She felt nothing. His anger was just another data point, a predictable emotional response to a paradigm shift he could not comprehend. She turned back to her tablet, her fingers flying across the screen. The aeolian vibration model needed refinement. The gunnery sergeant was a localized atmospheric disturbance, loud but ultimately transient. The mountain, however, was a constant, and it still had secrets to tell. She had work to do. The crisis arrived 3 weeks later, not with the roar of an explosion, but with the quiet, chilling certainty of a single line of text on a screen in the command center. A priority intelligence intercept, triple confirmed by assets in country, pinpointed the location of a man known only as the Architect. He was the strategic genius behind a new and devastatingly effective insurgency. A ghost who planned attacks with the precision of a master chess player, always 3 moves ahead. For months, he had been a phantom, his operations leaving a trail of dead soldiers and shattered outposts. Now, they had him. He was in a fortified command bunker carved into the face of the Titan's tooth, a jagged peak that loomed over a crucial valley pass, 20 kilometers north of FOB Black Ridge. The mood in the Tactical Operations Center, or TOC, shifted instantly from routine tension to a palpable electric hum. Maps were pulled up on the main screens, drone feeds were rerouted, and the FOB's commander, Major Jensen, stood before the holotable, his face grim. The Architect's bunker was a fortress. Its primary entrance was shielded by a natural rock overhang, and its only vulnerability was a single armor-plated viewport, no more than a meter wide, facing south. It was set deep into the cliffside, like the eye of a malevolent stone god. The problem was distance and environment. The bunker was situated at an elevation of 12,000 feet, at a range of just over 4,200 meters from the most viable observation post they could establish without being detected. It was a shot that existed only in the realm of theory and record book fantasy. An airstrike was considered and immediately dismissed. The architect had chosen his lair well. The Titan's tooth was geologically volatile, a mass of fractured rock held together by little more than gravity and frozen mud. The shockwave from a JDAM or a Hellfire missile would almost certainly trigger a catastrophic landslide, one that would not only entomb the bunker but also obliterate the village of Kell, a friendly settlement of goat herders and farmers located directly below in the valley. The collateral damage was unacceptable. It had to be a surgical strike. It had to be a single bullet. "Get me Croft," Major Jensen commanded, his voice tight. Gunnery Sergeant Croft entered the TOC like a storm front. This was his moment, the impossible shot, the hero's task. It was the kind of challenge upon which legends were built. His usual bravado was magnified, filling the confined space. He studied the topographical displays, a confident smirk playing on his lips. 4,200 meters, high angle, unstable air, he recited, more to himself than to the major. "It's a monster, but we can do it. My team, my rifle. We'll put a round right through his window." Jensen, a man who trusted his specialists, nodded. "You're sure, Gunny?" "Major, I can hit a target from the next zip code," Croft declared, his voice booming. "Just get my team into position. We'll handle the rest." The attempt was a study in orthodox failure. Croft and his spotter, a highly skilled corporal named Sanchez, were inserted by helicopter onto a windswept ridge codenamed Vantage. The air was thin and bitingly cold. For hours, they lay motionless, wrapped in camouflage that blended perfectly with the lichen-covered rock. They used the best equipment the Marine Corps could provide: a state-of-the-art M2010 sniper system, firing .300 Winchester Magnum rounds, a sophisticated ballistic computer, and a high-powered spotting scope. Croft was in his element, a predator waiting for the perfect moment. In the talk at Black Ridge, they watched the feeds. One camera showed the target, the dark slit of the viewport on the distant cliff face. Another showed Croft and Sanchez, two motionless lumps of rock and fabric. Alara Vance stood at the back of the room, silent and observant, her tablet glowing softly in the dim light. She had not been invited, but no one had told her to leave. She watched the data streams from her own sensors, which painted a far more complex picture of the battle space than the simple wind speed and humidity readings on Croft's Kestrel weather meter. Her display showed a swirling, invisible tempest of thermal pockets, unpredictable katabatic winds pouring down the mountainside like waterfalls of cold air, and the ever-present, low-level seismic hum. "Target is static," Sanchez's voice crackled over the comms. "Wind is 7 miles per hour, gusting to 9 from 3 o'clock. Full value, no mirage. Looks clean, Gunny." "I see it," Croft replied, his voice a low rumble of concentration. "Dialing it in, on my mark." The TOC held its collective breath. Croft's methods were classic, honed by 2 decades of experience. He read the wind by observing the movement of dust and grass near his position. He calculated the bullet's drop based on standard ballistic tables, adjusted for the altitude. He was a master of the known variables. The problem was the unknown ones. "Sending," Croft said. The rifle cracked on the audio feed. Seconds stretched into an eternity. Then, on the drone feed, they saw it. A tiny puff of pulverized rock, a full 3 meters to the left and 2 meters high of the viewport. A clean miss. "Damn it," Croft's voice was sharp with disbelief. "The wind sheared. It's not reading true. Give me a new solution, Sanchez." They tried again. Sanchez gave him a new wind call, compensating for the first miss. Croft fired. This time, the impact was closer, but still a meter low. The enemy was now alerted. A metal shutter began to slide down over the viewport. "They're closing the window. Take the shot, Gunny. Take the shot," Jensen yelled into his microphone. Croft, his composure cracking under the pressure, fired again, a rushed, angry shot. The bullet went wide, striking the cliff face harmlessly. The shutter clanged shut. The opportunity was gone. In the TOC, a wave of collective disappointment washed over the room. Major Jensen slammed his fist onto the console. "Stand down, Vantage. Return to base." The recriminations began instantly. Croft's voice over the comm was a torrent of fury, blaming the equipment, the intelligence, the wind itself. He refused to accept that his skill, his instinct, had failed him. He had tried to solve the problem with brute force and experience, and the mountain had simply shrugged him off. The architect was safe, the mission a failure, and Gunnery Sergeant Croft's flawless reputation had a new, very public crack in it. Alara Vance watched the swirling red and blue lines of her atmospheric model. They had shifted exactly as her simulation had predicted. The failure was not a surprise. It had been an inevitability. The aftermath of the failed attempt settled over the TOC like a shroud. Major Jensen paced back and forth, his face a mask of frustration, barking into his headset at Sector Command, trying to manage the fallout. The window of opportunity was closing fast. SIGINT chatter indicated the architect was preparing to relocate. They had hours, maybe less. Gunnery Sergeant Croft, having returned from the ridge, stood in the corner, his face thunderous. He was radiating a toxic aura of blame, deflecting any suggestion of error on his part. He was a man whose entire identity was built on infallibility, and that foundation was crumbling. The air was thick with the stench of failure and impending defeat. It was into this suffocating silence, broken only by the hum of electronics and the Major's tense conversation, that Alara Vance stepped forward. She moved from the shadows at the back of the room to the central hollow table, her movements calm and deliberate. She held her tablet in one hand. "Major," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it had a quality of absolute clarity that cut through the ambient noise like a scalpel. Every head in the room turned toward her. Croft shot her a look of pure venom. "Not now, contractor," Jensen snapped, holding up a hand without looking at her. "The architect will be exposed again in 74 minutes, Alara continued, her tone unchanged, as if stating a simple fact. "There is a scheduled data burst transmission to his subordinate cells. The bunker's internal comms antenna is located behind the viewport. They will have to open the shutter for 60 seconds to get a clear signal." Jensen stopped pacing. He turned to face her fully, his expression a mixture of surprise and skepticism. "How do you know that?" "I've been monitoring their EM spectrum since we arrived," she replied, a faint schematic of the enemy bunker appearing on her tablet screen. "Their transmission hardware is antiquated. It requires a direct line of sight to a geosynchronous satellite, which will be in the correct position at 1432 Zulu. They have no choice." A murmur went through the room. The intel team looked at each other, stunned. This was information their own multi-million-dollar signals intelligence platforms had missed. Croft took a step forward, his fists clenched. And what good does that do? We can't hit the target. The wind is impossible. It's a waste of time. The wind is not the primary problem, Alara stated, ignoring him and addressing the major directly. She swiped her finger across the tablet, and a complex, three-dimensional model of the air column between the firing position and the target appeared above the holotable, a shimmering, multicolored river of data. The issue is a layered thermal inversion caused by solar radiation on the gneiss strata, combined with predictable, low-amplitude seismic resonance. You aren't trying to shoot through a current. You are trying to shoot through a series of interacting waves. The standard ballistic models can't compute it. She paused, letting the information sink in. But I can. Her voice held no pride, no ego. It was a statement of capability. I have a firing solution. It will work. Croft let out a short, harsh laugh of disbelief. A firing solution? From what? Your magic rock collection? Major, this is insane. She's a civilian, a lab tech. You're going to bet the whole mission on her fantasy calculations? Major Jensen was a man caught between two impossible choices. On one side was Croft, the decorated veteran, the embodiment of proven methods, who had just failed spectacularly. On the other was this quiet, enigmatic woman, and her almost supernatural command of data he couldn't begin to understand. He looked at the fury in Croft's eyes, then at the placid certainty in Alara's. He was a good commander because he valued results over tradition, and tradition had just cost them their best chance. It was Corporal Davies, a young communications technician who had often watched Alara work with a quiet fascination, who broke the standoff. He had been studying the data she was projecting, his eyes wide. "Sir," he said, his voice hesitant but firm. "Her math, it's not just theory. Look at the way she's integrated the seismic data with the atmospheric pressure gradient. She's modeling the entire environment as a single, unified system. The standard models, they can't do that. They treat every variable as separate. She's treating them as connected. Sir, I think she's right." That was all Jensen needed. A single voice of validation from someone who understood the language of data. He looked at Alara. The fate of the mission and countless lives rested on this decision. He made it. "Do it," he said, his voice hard as iron. "Give her whatever she needs. You have one shot, Vance." Croft looked as if he had been physically struck. "Major, you can't be serious. You are relieving me for her?" "Gunnery Sergeant, you are relieved because your method failed," Jensen countered, his voice cold. "Her method has not yet been tried. Now stand aside, or I will have you removed from my TOC. Authority did not shift. It flowed. In that moment, the institutional power of Croft's rank evaporated, replaced by the situational power of Alara's competence. The Marines in the room, trained to follow a chain of command, now looked to her. She had not seized command. It had been given to her by the simple, undeniable gravity of her being the only person left with a viable plan. Croft, defeated and seething, retreated to the corner of the room, a titan dethroned, his presence now nothing more than a monument to his own obsolete pride. Alara, seemingly oblivious to the drama, simply nodded once at the major and turned to her work. "I'll need a rifle," she said. "Not the M2010, the one from my case, and a direct feed from my sensor network patched into the primary display." Her orders were quiet, precise, and utterly confident. The spell of chaos was broken, replaced by a new, more focused kind of tension. The ghost of the range was about to go to work. The execution was a symphony of quiet, methodical precision. It was nothing like Croft's rugged, instinctual performance. Ilara did not go to the vantage ridge. Instead, she directed the setup on a different crest, one Croft's team had dismissed as having a poor line of sight. It was slightly lower in elevation and further to the east. To the naked eye, it was a worse position. To Ilara's models, it was the only position. It was the one place where the complex environmental variables would align into a predictable, if narrow, path. The rifle she had called for was brought from its hardened Pelican case. It was not a standard military weapon. It was a custom-built chassis, skeletal and strange, with an oversized barrel and an action that looked more like a piece of scientific instrumentation. Wires snaked from the scope and stock to a small data port, which a technician, under her direction, connected to her tablet. The weapon was not just a tool for firing a projectile. It was the terminal node of her entire sensor network. It was an extension of her will, translated into the language of data. In the talk, the main screen now showed what Ilara saw. A split display showed the drone's view of the target and a complex wireframe overlay of her environmental model. Lines of light representing wind vectors, thermal gradients, and seismic waves pulsed and shifted. In the center was a small green circle, the firing solution. It was not aimed at the viewport. It was aimed at a point approximately 2 meters above and 4 meters to the right of it, a patch of empty air. Croft, watching from his corner, let out a contemptuous snort. "She's aiming at the sky! This is a farce!" Ilara, now in position on the ridge, was a study in stillness. She lay prone behind the rifle, but she was not looking through the scope in the traditional way. Her eyes were fixed on her tablet, which was mounted just below the optic. She was watching the data converge. A countdown timer appeared in the corner of the screen in the TOC, T-90 seconds. It was the time until the target satellite was in position. The shutter opened, and the precise, fleeting environmental window she had predicted would materialize. Her breathing was slow and even. Her heart rate, displayed as a calm, steady line on one of her readouts, was that of a person in deep meditation. She was not a warrior preparing for battle. She was a scientist conducting the final, critical step of an experiment. She had done the math. She had accounted for every variable. Now, all that was left was the execution. The physical act of pulling the trigger was the simplest part of the equation. "Shutter is opening," a voice from the intel station announced. On the drone feed, the dark metal plate began to slide upward, revealing the black eye of the viewport once more. The countdown on Ilara's screen hit 0. A cascade of environmental markers on her display flashed from yellow to green. The seismic hum peaked at exactly 2.8 hertz. A thermal updraft, borne miles away, reached the air column in front of her. The wind vectors aligned. For a fraction of a second, the chaotic atmosphere became a predictable corridor. "Now," Ilara said. Her voice over the comm was perfectly flat. The rifle fired. The sound was a sharp, clean crack, less a roar than a definitive statement. In the TOC, everyone stared at the screens, their breath held tight in their chests. The seconds ticked by, an agonizingly long silence stretching between cause and effect. 5 seconds, 10, 15. The bullet was traveling for nearly 20 seconds. Croft began to smile, a cruel, triumphant sneer. He opened his mouth to speak, to declare the final, definitive failure of her insane methods. "See, I told you!" His words were cut off. On the drone feed, something impossible happened. There was no puff of dust on the cliff face. There was no impact anywhere near the bunker. Instead, the center of the dark viewport simply dissolved. A small dark hole appeared, followed a millisecond later by a violent eruption of pressure from within. A spray of electronics, paper, and vaporized material blown outward. The SIGINT operator ripped off his headset, his eyes wide with shock. "Oh my God," he whispered. "The internal comms are broadcasting a flatline. Total system failure. Multiple biosigns. Gone. The architect is gone." Checkmate. A single custom-loaded 4.6-gram tungsten penetrator, fired into a corridor of air that existed for less than a second, had traveled over 4 kilometers. It had been lifted by a thermal wave, nudged by a seismic tremor, and guided by 1,000 data points to pass through a 1-meter window and obliterate the command console and the man standing in front of it, inside. It was not just a kill. It was a declaration of a new kind of war, fought not with instinct, but with physics. A profound, echoing silence filled the talk. The tension did not break. It transformed. It became awe. The Marines stared at the screen, at the silent smoking hole in the side of the mountain, and then at the feed showing the lone, still figure of Alara Vance on the ridge. Croft's face was slack, his jaw hanging open. The sneer was gone, replaced by a mask of utter, uncomprehending disbelief. The mountain had not been conquered by force. It had been solved like an equation. The shot was not just perfect. It was impossible, and she had made it. The aftermath in the TOC was surreal. The initial stunned silence slowly gave way to a flurry of hushed, professional activity. Reports were filed, confirmations were sent up the chain of command, and the logistics of extracting Alara were set in motion. But the atmosphere was fundamentally changed. The usual backslapping and loud congratulations that followed a successful mission were absent. In their place was a quiet, almost reverent sense of disbelief. The Marines moved with a new caution, their glances toward the main screen, where the evidence of the impossible shot still played on a loop, filled with a dawning understanding that the rules of their world had just been rewritten. It was then that the secure channel blinked to life on the primary monitor. The insignia of Sector Command flashed on the screen, followed by the face of Colonel Reese. He was a man in his late 50s, with intelligent eyes and a demeanor that radiated calm, deep-seated authority. His expression was not one of celebration. It was grim, serious, and focused. "Black Ridge TOC, this is Colonel Reese," he said, his voice crisp and clear. "Give me a status report on Operation Titan's fall." Major Jensen stepped forward, composing himself. "Colonel, target neutralized. The architect is confirmed KIA. Mission successful." Reese didn't even blink. He seemed entirely uninterested in the outcome of the mission. His gaze swept across the faces visible in the camera's view. "I have alerts flooding my desk from 3 different departments," he said, his voice dangerously level. "My question is not about the target. My question is, who authorized the operational deployment of Project Chimera?" There was a confused silence. Jensen frowned. "Sir, I don't know what that is. We used a contractor system to—" "A contractor?" Reese cut him off, a flicker of something that looked like anger in his eyes. "Major, there are no contractors cleared for that level of proprietary technology. Put Gunnery Sergeant Croft on screen." Croft, looking pale and shaken, moved woodenly into the camera's frame. He looked like a man walking to his own execution. He managed a weak, "Sir." Reese's eyes narrowed into slits. His voice dropped, losing its professional tone and becoming something sharp and personal. Gunnery Sergeant, I am reading a preliminary after-action report filed not 10 minutes ago. It details your repeated and public dismissal of critical environmental data. It details your attempt to execute a mission for which you were demonstrably unprepared, wasting time and alerting the enemy. It details your gross insubordination and unprofessional conduct toward a Pentagon-level asset. Is there anything in that summary you believe to be inaccurate before I have you formally relieved of duty and scheduled for a command inquiry for dereliction? Croft was speechless. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The edifice of his pride, his reputation, his entire career was being dismantled, brick by brick, in front of the very men he commanded. The color drained from his face, leaving it a sickly white. He was broken. The colonel seemed to dismiss him from existence, his gaze already searching for someone else. "Now," Reese said, his tone shifting again, becoming focused and professional once more. "Put Dr. Vance on the line." A path cleared for Ilara as she walked from the back of the room. She had returned from the ridge and stood, as always, on the periphery. She stepped into the light of the camera, her expression as neutral as ever. She looked like a technician, not a hero or a savior. The change in Colonel Reese's demeanor was immediate and startling. The hardness in his eyes softened, replaced by a deep, weary respect. "Ilara," he said, and the use of her first name sent a shockwave through the room. "Good to see you're still effective. Your field evaluation of the standard ballistic computers was, I take it, conclusive." "They are inadequate for complex environmental theaters," she replied, her voice flat. "The algorithms are 20 years old. They fail to account for integrated system dynamics." "I'll be sure to include that in your final report," Reese said, with a hint of dry irony. He then looked past her, his gaze sweeping over the stunned faces of Major Jensen and the rest of the TOC staff. His voice became formal again, the voice of a commander addressing his troops. "For those of you who are confused, allow me to clarify. You are looking at Dr. Ilara Vance. She is not a contractor. She is the lead physicist and chief architect of the Pentagon's Asymmetric Warfare Group. Project Chimera is her designation. The rifle, the sensors, the predictive environmental modeling software, she designed it all. She wrote the literal book on this kind of engagement." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. His eyes found Croft again, who looked like he was about to collapse. "Gunnery Sergeant, she wasn't sent here to assist you. She was sent here to evaluate you, and you have failed that evaluation in every conceivable way." The revelation hung in the air, recontextualizing everything. Her quietness was not shyness, it was focus. Her strange methods were not eccentricities, they were a higher form of science. Her unassuming presence was not a lack of authority. It was the ultimate authority, one so absolute it required no outward display. She was not an outsider who had stumbled into their world. They were test subjects in hers. A new order settled upon FOB Black Ridge, not by decree, but by the quiet, irresistible force of demonstrated fact. Gunnery Sergeant Croft was gone, transferred off the base before the next sunrise, his career over, his legend dissolving into a cautionary tale whispered among the junior enlisted. The throne he had occupied at the top of the base's social and professional hierarchy was left vacant, but no one dared try to fill it. The nature of power itself had been redefined. It was no longer loud, boisterous, and worn on a sleeve. It was quiet, analytical, and deadly accurate from 4,200 meters. The Marines treated Ilara with a new, profound reverence that bordered on fear. They gave her a wide berth, their conversations dropping to a hush when she passed. They no longer saw a strange contractor. They saw the architect of an impossible victory, a woman who conversed with mountains and commanded lightning. She, for her part, seemed utterly unaffected by the change. Her victory brought her no visible pleasure, just as Croft's scorn had brought her no anger. She simply returned to her work, calibrating her sensors, refining her models, her focus as absolute as ever. The mission was complete, but the experiment was ongoing. It was Corporal Davies, the young comms tech, who was the first to bridge the new gulf between them. He found her 2 days later, not on the range, but in her small, cluttered hut, the air thick with the smell of ozone and hot electronics. She was hunched over a piece of rock, examining its crystalline structure under a digital microscope. He hesitated at the door, a steaming mug of coffee in his hand. He didn't offer congratulations or thanks. He understood, on an intuitive level, that such things were meaningless to her. Instead, he approached her as a student would a master. He placed the mug gently on a clear spot on her workbench. "Dr. Vance," he began, his voice quiet and respectful. "That seismic resonance model you used, I was looking at the raw data. I don't understand how you filtered out the signal noise from the background tectonic plate chatter to isolate the aeolian vibration frequency. The quartz diorite stratification should have created a dozen harmonic ghost signals." Ilara looked up from her microscope. She studied him for a long moment, her pale gray eyes analytical. She saw no sycophancy, no hero worship. She saw genuine intellectual curiosity, a flicker of something that was not quite a smile, but a subtle softening of her features touched her face. It was the highest praise she was capable of giving. "The ghost signals are predictable," she said, turning her monitor so he could see. "You don't filter them out, you use them. They become a secondary validation layer for the primary frequency. Look." She began to explain, her voice taking on the low, steady rhythm of a professor delivering a lecture. Davies listened, completely absorbed, a bridge being built not of rank or camaraderie, but of pure, unadulterated data. Her departure was as quiet and unceremonious as her arrival. One morning, she was simply gone. Her hut was empty, the strange antennae gone from the roof, the web of sensors vanished from the ridgelines. All that remained was the memory of what she had done and the changes she had wrought. She left behind more than the corpse of an enemy commander buried in his own fortress. She left a lesson etched into the bedrock of the Asmar Range, a lesson that would be passed down from one generation of soldiers to the next. True authority is not granted by rank or earned by tradition. It is proven in the silent, deadly certainty of a single, perfect calculation. It belongs not to those who shout the loudest, but to those who listen the most intently to the subtle language of the world itself. And in the high, lonely places where the wind howls and the rock groans, her legend endured. A ghost in the machine, a whisper on the wind, the quiet professional who had taught a mountain and an army how to think.